The funeral director handed me the small brass key with a sympathetic smile, explaining that my father had left specific instructions for me to handle his safety deposit box alone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I stared at the worn metal in my palm, still wearing the black dress from his burial just 3 hours earlier, while my siblings argued loudly in the background about who would get his vintage tools and who had to deal with what they kept calling all that junk in the garage. I had no idea that this tiny key would unlock not just a metal box, but 15 years of lies, hidden sacrifices, and a truth that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family. I'm Sarah Mitchell, and at 28 I've always been the forgotten middle child in a family that seemed to have predetermined roles for everyone. Michael, my older brother, was the golden child who became a successful lawyer in Columbus, driving his BMW back to our small town of Riverside, Ohio, only for holidays and family emergencies. Jessica, my baby sister, was the creative free spirit who could do no wrong in our parents' eyes, currently bouncing between art projects and travel adventures funded by what she called strategic parental investment. And then there was me, the practical one, the nurse who stayed local, who checked on Dad when his arthritis flared up, who helped Mom with her real estate showings when she needed an extra pair of hands. Dad had been everything to me growing up. Robert Mitchell, everyone called him Bob, ran Mitchell's Auto Repair on the edge of town for 37 years. He was the kind of man who never met a broken thing he couldn't fix, whether it was a car engine, a neighbor's lawnmower, or a daughter's broken heart after a bad breakup. His hands were permanently stained with motor oil, his work shirts always carried the scent of WD-40 and coffee, and he had this way of listening that made you feel like you were the only person in the world who mattered. The garage behind our house was his sanctuary, filled with decades of accumulated parts, tools, and what everyone else called junk, but what Dad called possibilities. He'd spend evenings out there, classical music playing softly from an old radio, working on projects that seemed to have no deadline or purpose beyond the satisfaction of creating something with his hands. I was the only one who ever joined him, handing him wrenches and learning to diagnose engine problems by sound alone. Mom always said I was too much like him for my own good, spending time in that dusty garage instead of focusing on more feminine pursuits like Jessica or ambitious career goals like Michael. Linda Mitchell was all sharp edges and efficiency, a woman who transformed our small-town real estate market through sheer force of will and an uncanny ability to match families with their perfect homes. She loved Dad, I knew that, but she never understood his need to tinker, to save things that looked worthless to everyone else. The day Dad collapsed at the garage, Tom Bradley found him. Tom had been Dad's business partner for over 2 decades. A quiet man with gentle eyes who handled the customer service side while Dad worked his magic on the mechanical problems. Tom called the ambulance, rode with Dad to Riverside General, and stayed in the waiting room while the doctors delivered the news that massive heart attack had been too sudden, too severe. There was nothing anyone could have done. The funeral was everything Dad would have hated. Mom insisted on the expensive casket, the elaborate flower arrangements, the reception at the country club instead of the simple gathering at our house that he'd always talked about wanting. Michael flew in from Columbus and immediately began discussing estate logistics, while Jessica arrived from her latest adventure in Portland, with dramatic stories of barely making it home in time. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. I stood between them during the service, listening to a pastor who barely knew Dad deliver generic platitudes about a man whose greatest joy came from bringing old engines back to life. After the burial, as we gathered back at the house, the attorney David Park requested a private moment with our family. He was a soft-spoken man in his 60s who had handled Dad's legal affairs for years, and he spread the will documents across Mom's dining room table with careful precision. The contents were straightforward enough. The house and primary assets went to Mom. The garage and business equipment would be split between Michael and me, with Jessica receiving Dad's modest savings account and life insurance policy. But then David handed me that brass key, explaining that Dad had maintained a safety deposit box at First National Bank for the past 15 years, and that his instructions specified I should handle its contents alone, without family involvement. The room fell silent for a moment before Michael laughed dismissively. Probably just more of his sentimental nonsense, he said, loosening his tie with the air of someone eager to return to more important matters. Sarah's always been the one who appreciated Dad's collection of random junk anyway. Jessica nodded in agreement, already scrolling through her phone to check flight prices back to Portland. You know how he was about keeping everything. Remember that box of old spark plugs he insisted were vintage, even though they were completely useless? Mom reached across the table and squeezed my hand briefly. Your father always had his little projects and collections, honey. I'm sure it's nothing significant, probably just some papers he wanted to keep private. You know how men can be about their personal space. I closed my fingers around the key, feeling its weight despite its small size. There was something in David's expression, a careful neutrality that suggested he knew more than he was sharing. When I asked if he knew what was in the box, he simply replied that client confidentiality prevented him from discussing the specifics, but that Dad had been very particular about the arrangements. The next morning, while Mom began the process of sorting through Dad's clothes and Michael started cataloging tools in the garage with the efficiency of someone conducting a business inventory, I drove to First National Bank. The building was one of those solid brick structures that had anchored downtown Riverside since the 1940s. And I'd been inside countless times over the years, usually helping Dad with business deposits or loan paperwork for equipment purchases. Mrs. Patterson, the branch manager, greeted me with the same sympathetic expression I'd been receiving all week. She verified my identification, checked Dad's instructions, and led me to a small private room where she retrieved box number 247 from the vault. The metal container was larger than I'd expected, about the size of a briefcase, and surprisingly heavy. Take all the time you need, dear, she said softly, closing the door behind her as she left me alone. I sat in the small chair, staring at the box for several minutes before lifting the lid. Inside, instead of the random collection of sentimental items I'd expected, I found something that made my heart stop. The box was filled with documents, photographs, and what appeared to be financial records, all meticulously organized in manila folders with dates spanning the past 15 years. The first folder contained bank statements from an account I'd never heard of, showing regular deposits that totaled amounts far larger than what Dad's garage business should have generated. The deposits came from various sources: insurance settlements, legal payments, and monthly transfers from companies I didn't recognize. As I traced the paper trail, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Dad hadn't just been a small-town mechanic struggling to make ends meet, as Mom had always claimed when justifying her tight control over family finances and her frequent complaints about money. He had been quietly supporting not just our family, but also Tom's family, when Tom's wife was battling cancer, helping to pay for Mrs. Carter's medical bills when she couldn't afford her medications, and contributing to a fund that provided car repairs for single mothers and elderly residents who couldn't afford them. The photographs in the second folder showed Dad at various community events I'd never known he attended: volunteer appreciation dinners, charity fundraisers, and recognition ceremonies where he'd apparently received awards for community service. In picture after picture, he stood quietly in the background, never seeking attention, never claiming credit, just present and helping wherever needed. But it was the contents of the third folder that made me sink back in my chair, hands trembling as I read documents that changed everything I thought I understood about my family. Legal papers showing that Dad had been making monthly payments on a mortgage that wasn't ours, correspondence with attorneys regarding a property I'd never heard of, and then a deed showing that Robert Mitchell owned a small house on Pine Street, a house that had been home to the Patterson family for the past 12 years. I knew the Patterson family. Mary Patterson worked at the elementary school cafeteria, raising 3 kids alone after her husband died in a construction accident. Those kids had grown up with decent clothes, school supplies, and opportunities that should have been impossible on a cafeteria worker's salary. They'd never known that their stability came from a mechanic who quietly paid their rent every month, who covered their emergency expenses, who made sure they never faced eviction or hunger. The final folder contained letters, dozens of them, written in Dad's careful handwriting, addressed to me but never sent. Letters explaining that he'd kept these secrets because Mom couldn't understand his need to help others, because she saw any money not directed toward family advancement as wasteful charity. Letters describing how proud he was of my choice to become a nurse, how he saw in me the same desire to help people that had driven his quiet philanthropy for years. Letters apologizing for not being able to share this part of his life with me while he was alive, and expressing his hope that I would understand and perhaps continue what he'd started. One letter, dated just 6 months earlier, contained a confession that made me gasp aloud. Dad explained that he'd been diagnosed with early heart disease, that his doctor had warned him about stress and overwork, but that he'd kept it secret because he was afraid Mom would force him to retire before he'd arranged for someone else to take over his community commitments. He'd been working longer hours, taking on more repair jobs, trying to build up enough reserve funds to ensure the people he helped wouldn't suffer if something happened to him. The man my family had dismissed as a simple mechanic who collected junk had been living a completely different life, one where his garage business was actually a thriving operation that he'd deliberately downplayed to avoid Mom's interference. He'd been a pillar of the community, helping families survive crises, enabling kids to stay in school, ensuring that elderly neighbors could afford their medications. And he'd hidden it all, because he knew that sharing it would lead to family conflicts he couldn't bear to navigate. At the bottom of the box, I found one final item: a business plan, professionally prepared and notarized, outlining Dad's vision for transforming Mitchell's Auto Repair into a non-profit community garage where people could get reliable car maintenance regardless of their ability to pay. The plan included detailed financial projections, partnership agreements with local social services, and a training program for young adults interested in automotive careers. It was ambitious, comprehensive, and completely unlike anything the man I thought I knew would have conceived. A note attached to the business plan explained that Dad had been working with David Park and Tom Bradley to establish a foundation that would continue his work after his death. The safety deposit box contained enough documentation to prove that Dad's estate was worth nearly 10 times what the family will had indicated, with the bulk of his wealth held in accounts specifically designated for community service. He'd left detailed instructions for me to decide whether to reveal this information to the family or to work quietly with Tom and David to implement his plans without family involvement. I sat in that small bank room for nearly 2 hours, reading and rereading documents that painted a picture of a man I'd lived with for 28 years but had never really known. The father who'd taught me to change oil and diagnose engine trouble had also been teaching the Patterson kids how to manage money and study for their SATs. The man who'd listened patiently to my nursing school stress had been counseling Mrs. Carter through her husband's dementia progression. The mechanic who'd always seemed content with simple pleasures had been orchestrating a complex network of support that had touched dozens of lives in our small community. When I finally left the bank, the key heavy in my pocket and copies of the most important documents in my purse, I drove not toward home but toward Pine Street. I needed to see the Patterson house, to understand this part of Dad's life that had been completely hidden from his own family. The small, neat house with its well-maintained yard and children's bicycles in the driveway looked exactly like what it was: a home where a family had been able to thrive because someone cared enough to ensure their stability. As I sat in my car across the street, Mary Patterson emerged from the front door, heading toward her mailbox. She was a woman about Mom's age, with graying hair and the tired but determined expression of someone who'd been carrying heavy responsibilities for years. When she spotted my car, she approached with the cautious friendliness of someone unsure whether I was lost or looking for directions. "Can I help you with something, honey?" she asked through my rolled-down window. I struggled to find words. "I'm Sarah Mitchell, Bob Mitchell's daughter." Her entire expression transformed, from caution to recognition to something that looked like grief mixed with deep gratitude. "Oh, sweetheart," she breathed, reaching through the window to clasp my hand. "Your father was an angel, an absolute angel. I don't know how we would have survived without him." Tears filled her eyes as she continued. "When my husband died, I thought we'd lose the house within 6 months. I was working part-time at the school, barely making enough for groceries, let alone rent. Then one day, this man shows up at my door, introduces himself as Bob Mitchell, and tells me he's bought the house and I can just keep living here, keep paying what I can afford, no pressure. He said he understood what it was like to worry about your kids' future. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. For 12 years, that man made sure my babies had a home. He never asked for thanks, never made me feel like charity. Just said he was glad he could help and did I need anything else fixed around the place. My oldest graduated valedictorian last year, got a full scholarship to Ohio State. My middle boy starting at the community college this fall wants to be a mechanic like your dad. And my little girl, she's only 14, but she's already talking about being a nurse like someone she knows. The casual mention that her daughter wanted to be a nurse hit me like a physical blow. Like someone she knows. Mary smiled through her tears. Your father talked about you all the time. How proud he was of his daughter, the nurse. How you were following your heart to help people even when it wasn't the easy path. He said you were proof that raising kids right meant teaching them to care about others, not just themselves. I couldn't speak, couldn't process the revelation that Dad had been proud of me in ways he'd never directly expressed, that he'd been sharing his pride with the people he helped, that my career choice had somehow validated his own approach to life. Is he really gone? Mary asked softly. I saw the obituary in the paper, but it seemed impossible. He was just here last month, helping Tommy fix his car so he could get to his new job. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Mary squeezed my hand again. He was the best man I ever knew, she said simply. And if you're anything like him, this world is lucky to have you. As I drove home, my mind raced with questions and revelations. How many other families had Dad helped? How many people in Riverside owed their stability to a man who'd pretended to be struggling financially? How had he managed to hide such an extensive operation from Mom, from all of us? And most importantly, what was I supposed to do with this information? The house felt different when I walked through the front door. Mom was in the kitchen, sorting through Dad's papers with the methodical efficiency she brought to all tasks. Michael was on a work call in the living room, his laptop open as he multitasked between family obligations and client demands. Jessica was packing in her childhood bedroom, having already decided to return to Portland the next morning. How did it go at the bank? Mom asked without looking up from her sorting. Please tell me it wasn't more of those old car magazines he was always collecting. I stood in the doorway, watching her dismiss Dad's life with the same casual disregard she'd always shown for his interests. It was paperwork, I said carefully. Legal documents and things. Probably insurance papers or warranty information for the garage equipment, she replied with a slight sigh. Your father never could throw anything away, even when it was completely outdated. Michael ended his call and joined us in the kitchen. Sarah, while you were gone, I started making lists of the tools and equipment. There's definitely value there, but a lot of it is pretty specialized. We might need to find someone who knows vintage automotive equipment to get fair prices. He pulled out his phone and showed me photos he'd taken of Dad's workbenches, organized tool chests, and equipment that I now realized represented not just a hobby, but a thriving business operation. Some of this stuff looks like antiques, might be worth more than we initially thought. Jessica wandered in, dragging her suitcase behind her. I can't believe how much random stuff Dad accumulated over the years. It's going to take forever to sort through everything. Maybe we should just donate most of it and save ourselves the hassle. I looked around at my family, all of them focused on the practical aspects of Dad's death, none of them curious about the man behind the accumulation they were so eager to distribute or discard. The weight of the secrets I'd discovered pressed against my chest like a physical burden. What if there's more to it than we realize? I asked quietly. Michael glanced up from his phone. More to what? Dad's business, his finances. What if he wasn't just scraping by like we always assumed? Mom made a dismissive sound. Sarah, honey, I handled the family finances for 30 years. I know exactly what your father's business generated. He was a good mechanic, but he was terrible at charging what his work was worth. Half the time, he'd fix someone's car and forget to send them a bill. She wasn't wrong about that last part, I realized. Dad had forgotten to send bills because he'd been deliberately not charging people who couldn't afford to pay. But what if he had other income sources? I pressed. Other investments or accounts? Like what? Jessica asked, genuine curiosity in her voice for the first time all week. I hesitated. The documents in the safety deposit box gave me the power to transform this conversation, to reveal a truth that would change how they saw Dad forever. But Dad's letters had made it clear that he'd kept these secrets specifically to avoid the family conflicts that full disclosure would inevitably create. I don't know, I said finally. Just seems like we should be thorough before we start dividing everything up. Michael nodded approvingly. That's good thinking. David Park mentioned there might be some business assets we haven't accounted for yet. Maybe we should schedule another meeting with him before making any major decisions. Mom gathered the papers she'd been sorting into neat stacks. If it makes you feel better, we can certainly double-check everything. But don't get your hopes up, Sarah. Your father was many wonderful things, but a shrewd businessman wasn't one of them. As my family continued their practical discussions around me, I felt the enormous weight of carrying Dad's secret alone. The man they were casually dismissing as financially naive had been supporting families, funding educations, and quietly transforming lives for 15 years. He'd built something remarkable while hiding in plain sight, and now I had to decide whether his story would die with him or continue in some new form. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, Dad's letters spread across my nightstand. In one of his final notes, he'd written something that felt like a direct message across the divide between life and death. The most important repairs aren't the ones people see. They're the ones that keep things running smoothly behind the scenes, the small adjustments that prevent bigger breakdowns down the road. I hope you'll understand that some things are worth fixing, even when nobody knows you're doing the work. I thought about Mary Patterson's daughter who wanted to be a nurse, about Tom Bradley who'd silently partnered in Dad's community work, about all the people whose lives had been quietly stabilized by a man my own family had never fully understood. The brass key sat on my nightstand, catching the moonlight like a small beacon pointing toward possibilities I was only beginning to comprehend. The morning after my sleepless night, I woke to the sound of voices downstairs and the smell of coffee brewing. I'd been clutching Dad's letters so tightly that the paper had left imprints on my palms. Through my bedroom window, I could see Tom Bradley's pickup truck in our driveway, and my heart jumped. Tom had been Dad's business partner for 20 years, which meant he had to know about the community work, the secret accounts, the elaborate network of support Dad had been operating. I threw on jeans and a sweater, stuffing the most important documents from the safety deposit box into my purse before heading downstairs. In the kitchen, I found Tom sitting at our round table with Mom, Michael, and Jessica, all of them nursing coffee cups, and wearing the polite expressions people use when they're not sure how to navigate grief together. Tom looked like he'd aged a decade since Dad's funeral. His usually neat gray hair was disheveled, his work shirt wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of his own sleepless nights. When he saw me, something flickered in his expression, a question mixed with what looked like hope. "Morning, Sarah," he said quietly. "I came by to talk to your family about the garage, about what Bob might have wanted for the business moving forward." Mom poured me coffee without being asked, a small kindness that reminded me why Dad had loved her despite their differences. "Tom was just explaining that your father had some unusual arrangements with certain customers," she said, her tone carrying the slight disapproval she'd always reserved for Dad's tendency to be too generous with payment plans. "Unusual how?" I asked, settling into the chair across from Tom. Michael looked up from his phone, where he'd been scrolling through emails. Apparently, Dad had some kind of informal barter system going. People trading services instead of paying cash, that sort of thing. Tom thinks it might complicate the asset evaluation. Tom's eyes met mine across the table, and I saw him weighing his words carefully. "Your dad believed in helping folks however he could," he said slowly. Sometimes that meant accepting payment in ways that didn't show up in traditional bookkeeping. I felt my pulse quicken. This was Tom's way of testing the waters, seeing if I knew anything about Dad's real activities. "What kind of services?" I asked. "Well," Tom said, glancing at Mom before continuing, "Mrs. Henderson paid for her transmission work by doing bookkeeping for us. The Ramirez family covered their brake job by having their landscaping business maintain the garage property. Bob always said money wasn't the only way people could contribute. Mom sighed, stirring her coffee with more force than necessary. Your father never could turn away a sob story. I told him for years that running a business on good intentions wouldn't pay our bills. But the bills always got paid, Jessica pointed out, looking genuinely puzzled. I mean, we never went without anything. I had dance lessons, Michael had tennis camp, Sarah got her nursing school tuition covered. If Dad was giving away free car repairs all the time, how did we afford all that? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Tom's fingers drummed nervously against his coffee cup, and I realized he was waiting for someone in my family to ask the right follow-up questions, to show some curiosity about the man they'd lived with for decades. Michael, ever the lawyer, leaned forward with renewed interest. That's actually a good point, Jess. The numbers should add up. But if Dad was as financially naive as we always thought, where did the money come from for extras? Your father worked very hard, Mom said firmly, but there was something defensive in her tone that suggested she'd wondered about this herself. He put in long hours, and he was excellent at what he did. People came from 3 counties over to have Bob Mitchell work on their cars. Tom nodded slowly. That's true. Bob had a reputation that brought in more business than most folks realized. He was modest about his success, didn't like to brag. I watched this careful dance of partial truths, understanding that Tom was trying to honor Dad's memory while respecting whatever reasons had led to the secrecy. But sitting here listening to my family dismiss Dad's capabilities while Tom struggled to defend him without revealing the full scope of what they'd accomplished together felt unbearable. Tom, I said quietly, could we talk privately for a few minutes? I have some questions about the garage operations that might be easier to discuss without boring everyone else with technical details. He looked relieved at the suggestion. Of course. Maybe we could walk through the shop, take a look at the current projects. Michael waved a hand dismissively. You two go ahead. I need to make some calls anyway, and Mom wanted to finish sorting through Dad's desk. As Tom and I walked toward the garage, I could feel the weight of Dad's secrets pulling at me like gravity. The familiar space looked different, now that I understood what had really been happening here. The meticulously organized tool chests, the detailed work logs, the area Dad had always called his planning corner, where he kept clipboards and notebooks that I'd assumed were simple maintenance records. Tom closed the garage door behind us and turned to face me, his expression serious. Sarah, I need to know something. Did your dad leave you any information about the foundation? About the accounts? My heart hammered against my ribs. You know about the foundation? Relief flooded his features. Thank God. I've been trying to figure out how to handle this without betraying Bob's wishes about family privacy. But there are people counting on support that can't wait much longer. I pulled the documents from my purse, spreading them across Dad's main workbench. I found these in his safety deposit box yesterday. Tom, I had no idea about any of this. The Patterson House, the community fund, the business plan for the nonprofit garage. How long have you known? Tom studied the papers with familiar recognition. Since the beginning. Bob came to me about 15 years ago with this crazy idea about using our automotive skills to help people beyond just fixing their cars. Said he'd been watching families in town struggle with transportation issues that kept them from getting to work, getting their kids to school, accessing medical care. He picked up the nonprofit business plan, flipping through pages he'd obviously seen before. This was his dream, Sarah. Turn Mitchell's auto repair into something bigger. Something that could provide reliable transportation solutions for people, regardless of their financial situation. Training programs for young adults. Sliding scale payment systems, partnerships with social services. But why keep it secret from us? I asked, though I was beginning to understand the answer. Tom glanced toward the house where we could see Mom through the kitchen window, still organizing papers with characteristic efficiency. Your mother is a good woman, Sarah, but she and Bob had very different ideas about money and responsibility. She worked hard to build security for your family, and she saw Bob's generosity as a threat to that security. He moved to Dad's planning corner, opening a notebook that revealed detailed records of every family Dad had helped, every emergency repair provided at no cost, every scholarship contribution made through the foundation. Bob tried to include her in the decision-making early on, but she got upset about what she called throwing money at other people's problems when we had our own future to secure. So he started handling it quietly, using business income she didn't track. He was lying to her, I said, though the words felt wrong even as I spoke them. He was protecting her, Tom corrected gently, and protecting his ability to help people. Bob understood that sometimes doing the right thing means finding ways around obstacles rather than fighting them directly. I thought about Mom's reaction to any suggestion that Dad might have been more financially successful than she'd realized, the automatic dismissal, the irritation at the possibility that her understanding of their life together might be incomplete. Dad had chosen secrecy not out of deception, but out of love for both his family and his community, understanding that full transparency would create conflicts that would ultimately help no one. What happens now? I asked. Dad's gone, and there are people depending on support that Mom doesn't even know exists. Tom rubbed his forehead, looking exhausted. That depends on you, Sarah. Bob left very specific instructions with David Park about transferring control of the foundation to you if you were willing to take it on, but only if you think you can handle it without destroying your family relationships. The magnitude of what he was suggesting hit me like a physical blow. Dad wasn't just asking me to keep his secrets. He was asking me to become the guardian of an entire network of community support, to step into a role he'd been preparing for years without ever telling me. I don't know anything about running a foundation, I protested. I'm a nurse, not a financial manager or community organizer. Bob thought your nursing background was perfect preparation, Tom said with a small smile. He always said healthcare and community support were basically the same work, just applied to different problems. Both require understanding people's needs, coordinating resources, and maintaining systems that prevent small issues from becoming big crises. He opened another notebook, this one filled with Dad's handwriting detailing not just financial records, but personal notes about each family they'd helped. Mrs. Patterson's youngest was struggling with math and needed tutoring. The Ramirez family was saving for their oldest son's college applications. Mr. Henderson was dealing with early-stage diabetes and needed help affording medication until his insurance kicked in. Your dad didn't just write checks, Sarah. He knew these people, understood their specific situations, tailored his help to what would actually make a difference in their lives. That's not something you can hire someone else to do. That requires the kind of caring that can't be faked. I stared at pages of Dad's careful notes, seeing for the first time the depth of his involvement in people's lives. This wasn't charity in the abstract. It was a complex web of relationships built over years of genuine connection and mutual respect. How many people are we talking about? I asked. Tom flipped to a summary page. Currently, the foundation provides ongoing support to 12 families, covering everything from housing assistance to medical expenses to educational costs. We also maintain an emergency fund that handles crisis situations, car repairs for people who can't afford them, and a scholarship program that's put 8 local kids through college over the past 5 years. The numbers were staggering. Dad had been operating what amounted to a private social service agency while pretending to struggle with basic business management. And he'd done it so seamlessly that his own family had never suspected the scope of his impact. There's something else, Tom said quietly. Bob was in the process of setting up a partnership with the county's social services department. They'd been looking for reliable automotive support for their clients, and Bob had developed a proposal that would have brought in government funding to expand the program. He was supposed to present it to the county commissioners next month. I felt a surge of grief so powerful it nearly brought me to my knees. Dad had been building something remarkable, something that would have helped hundreds of people, and he'd died before seeing it come to fruition. All his careful planning, all his quiet sacrifices left unfinished. Could we still present it? I asked impulsively. Tom's eyes widened. You'd want to do that? I don't know, I admitted. But it feels wrong to let his work die with him just because I'm scared of complications with my family. We spent the next hour going through Dad's files, and with each folder I opened, my admiration for his work grew alongside my frustration with the impossible position he'd put me in. How was I supposed to honor his legacy while maintaining the family peace he'd been so careful to preserve? By the time we returned to the house, Michael was pacing the kitchen with his phone pressed to his ear, clearly agitated about something work-related. Mom had moved her sorting operation to the living room, where Dad's desk was slowly being emptied of what she considered important papers versus obvious trash. Jessica was back to scrolling through her phone, occasionally showing Mom photos from her Portland adventures. "Find anything interesting in the garage?" Mom asked without looking up from a stack of receipts she was examining. "Just getting a better sense of Dad's customer relationships," I said carefully. "Tom's been really helpful explaining how the business actually operated." Tom nodded. Bob kept excellent records. Very thorough documentation of all his work. Michael ended his call and rejoined us, looking frustrated. "Sorry about that. Crisis with a client back in Columbus. I'm going to need to drive back tonight instead of tomorrow morning." He turned to me. "Sarah, since you seem to be diving deep into Dad's business affairs, maybe you could coordinate with Tom about selling the equipment. I trust your judgment, and honestly, I don't have time to micromanage every detail." The casual delegation of responsibility felt like a gift and a burden simultaneously. Michael's trust meant I'd have more freedom to investigate Dad's real legacy, but it also meant I'd be carrying the weight of those discoveries alone. "What about the house?" Jessica asked. "Are we keeping it, or is Mom thinking about downsizing?" Mom looked around the living room with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I haven't decided yet. This place holds a lot of memories, but it's probably too big for just me. The real estate market is strong right now, so it might make sense to sell while property values are high." The idea of selling Dad's house, dismantling the garage where he'd built his community network, felt like erasing the last physical evidence of his real life. But I couldn't explain my reaction without revealing secrets I wasn't sure I was ready to share. "Maybe we shouldn't rush into any major decisions," I suggested. "There might be business considerations we haven't fully explored yet." Mom smiled at me with the patient expression she'd always used when she thought I was being overly sentimental. "Honey, I know you have wonderful memories of spending time in that garage with your father, but we can't let emotions cloud practical judgment. The property is valuable, and the equipment could bring in significant money if we sell it to the right buyers." Tom cleared his throat. "Actually, Mrs. Mitchell, there might be some business opportunities worth considering before making any permanent changes." Bob had been discussing some expansion ideas that could significantly increase the property's value. The lie came so smoothly I almost believed it myself. Tom was buying us time, creating space to figure out how to handle Dad's legacy without destroying it in the process. Michael perked up at the mention of increased value. "What kind of expansion ideas?" "Nothing concrete yet," Tom said quickly. "Just preliminary discussions about potentially partnering with other local businesses. Maybe expanding the customer base. Would need time to research the viability." I felt a surge of gratitude toward Tom for his careful maneuvering, his ability to plant seeds of possibility without revealing the full scope of Dad's plans. He understood, as Dad had, that sometimes protecting important work meant finding creative ways around potential obstacles. That evening, after Michael had driven back to Columbus and Jessica had retreated to her room to pack, I found myself alone with Mom in the kitchen. She was washing dishes with the methodical precision she brought to all domestic tasks, and for a moment, watching her careful movements, I saw her as Dad must have. A woman who'd worked tirelessly to create stability and security for her family, whose fierce protectiveness had sometimes clashed with his desire to extend that protection to others. "Mom," I said carefully, "what do you think Dad would have wanted us to do with the garage?" She paused in her dishwashing, considering the question seriously. "Your father loved that garage more than anything except this family," she said finally. "If there was a way to keep it running, to honor the work he did there, I think that would have made him happy. Even if it meant continuing to help people who couldn't always pay full price for repairs." Mom sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. "Your father had a good heart, Sarah. Maybe too good for his own financial well-being, but I can't fault him for wanting to help people. I just worried that his generosity would leave us vulnerable if he got sick or couldn't work. The irony was almost unbearable. Mom's fears about financial vulnerability had prevented her from seeing that Dad had actually built something far more secure and sustainable than a traditional auto repair business. His network of community support, his diversified income streams, his careful documentation and planning had created exactly the kind of security she'd been working toward through more conventional means. "What if he was more financially successful than we realized?" I asked gently. Mom turned to look at me, dish towel in her hands, her expression skeptical but not dismissive. "What makes you think that?" I pulled out one of the less revealing bank statements from my purse, one that showed Dad's business account balances without detailing the foundation work. Tom helped me understand some of Dad's record keeping. It looks like the garage was actually doing better than Dad let on. Mom studied the numbers, her expression shifting from skepticism to surprise to something that looked like hurt. "Why wouldn't he have told me about this? We could have paid off the house years earlier, could have built up better retirement savings. Maybe he was saving it for something special," I suggested. Tom mentioned that Dad had been talking about expansion possibilities. The conversation continued for another hour, with Mom gradually opening to the possibility that Dad's financial picture had been more complex than she'd understood. I didn't reveal the full scope of his community work, but I planted seeds that might eventually grow into acceptance if and when the truth came to light. Later that night, I called Tom from my childhood bedroom, speaking in whispers to avoid waking Mom. "I think I want to try," I told him. "To continue Dad's work, I mean. But I need to understand exactly what I'd be taking on." "Are you sure, Sarah? Once you're officially involved, it becomes much harder to maintain the secrecy your dad thought was necessary." I looked out my bedroom window toward the garage, where a light Tom had left on cast familiar shadows across Dad's workbenches. Maybe it's time for the secrecy to end. Maybe there's a way to honor what Dad built, while also being honest with my family about who he really was. Tom was quiet for a long moment. "That's a risk your dad wasn't willing to take." "Dad made his choices based on the family dynamics he was dealing with 15 years ago, I said. "Things change. People change. Maybe it's time to find out if we can handle the truth." The next morning, I woke with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since before Dad's death. I had a plan, risky and complicated, but a plan nonetheless. I was going to spend the next week learning everything I could about Dad's foundation work, meeting the people he'd helped, understanding the full scope of his impact. Then I was going to decide whether to continue his legacy of secrecy, or to trust my family with the truth about the man they'd never fully known. Either way, I wasn't going to let his work die simply because it was easier to maintain comfortable lies than to navigate difficult conversations. Dad had spent 15 years protecting others while protecting us from knowledge he thought we couldn't handle. It was time to find out if he'd been right to doubt us, or if we were stronger than he'd given us credit for. Monday morning arrived with gray clouds threatening rain, matching the heaviness in my chest as I prepared to put my plan into action. I had spent the weekend learning the names and stories of every family Dad had helped, memorizing the details Tom had shared about ongoing commitments and upcoming needs. Today, I was going to meet David Park and formally take control of Dad's foundation, then begin the delicate process of revealing the truth to my family. David's office sat above the downtown coffee shop in a building that had housed lawyers and accountants for 3 generations. The narrow staircase creaked under my feet as I climbed to the 2nd floor, carrying a folder full of questions and a stomach full of nerves. David greeted me with the same careful professionalism he'd shown at the house, but there was relief in his eyes when I explained why I'd come. "Your father was very specific about the transition process," he said, pulling out a thick file labeled with my name. "He wanted to ensure you had complete information before making any commitments, and he insisted on building in exit strategies if you decided the responsibility was too overwhelming." The legal documents were more complex than I'd expected. Dad hadn't just been writing checks to people in need. He'd created a sophisticated system of trusts, educational funds, and emergency assistance programs that required ongoing management and decision-making. The foundation's assets totaled nearly $400,000, with monthly commitments that exceeded what most families in Riverside earned in a year. "The beauty of your father's system," David explained, is that it's designed to be self-sustaining. The automotive business generates enough profit to cover operational expenses, while the investment accounts provide the funding for assistance programs. He spent years perfecting the balance. I studied cash flow projections that showed Dad's careful planning, his ability to anticipate needs and allocate resources months in advance. This wasn't the work of someone playing at charity. This was the result of genuine business acumen applied to community service. What about the county partnership he was developing? I asked. David's expression brightened. That could transform everything, Sarah. Government contracts would triple our funding capacity and provide official recognition that could attract additional private donors. Your father was scheduled to present his proposal to the county commissioners next Friday. Could I present it instead? The meeting is still on the calendar, he said carefully, but you'd need to be prepared to answer detailed questions about operational capacity, oversight procedures, financial accountability. The commissioners aren't easy to impress. I thought about my nursing background, years of managing complex patient care coordination, working with insurance companies and social service agencies, advocating for families navigating bureaucratic systems. Maybe Dad had been right that my professional experience was better preparation than I'd realized. Set up the meeting, I told David. I'll be ready. That afternoon, I drove to the elementary school where Mary Patterson worked. I'd called ahead asking if we could talk during her lunch break, and she'd agreed to meet me in the faculty lounge. When I arrived, she was heating soup in the microwave, still wearing the hairnet and apron that marked her as cafeteria staff. Sarah, she said warmly, how are you holding up? I know this must be such a difficult time. I'm managing, I replied, accepting the coffee she offered. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about my father's work, about the help he provided your family. Mary's expression grew cautious. He asked us not to talk about it with anyone, said it was private business that didn't need to be public knowledge. I understand his reasoning, I said carefully, but circumstances have changed. I'm trying to continue what he started, and that might require being more open about the scope of his community involvement. Relief flooded her features. Oh, thank goodness. I've been so worried about what would happen now that he's gone. Tommy needs new tires before winter, and Maria's starting high school next year with all the expenses that involves. We talked for 40 minutes, and with each story Mary shared, my understanding of Dad's impact deepened. He hadn't just paid their rent, he'd attended Tommy's basketball games, helped Maria with her college application essays, connected them with other resources when their needs exceeded what he could provide directly. He'd become a genuine part of their extended family. Your father understood something most people don't, Mary said as our conversation wound down. Poverty isn't just about money. It's about isolation, about feeling like nobody cares whether you succeed or fail. Bob made us feel seen, valued, like our struggles mattered to someone. That evening, I found Mom in Dad's garage, standing among his tools with an expression I couldn't quite read. She'd been avoiding the space since his death, claiming it made her too sad, but tonight she was running her fingers along his main workbench, like she was trying to memorize its surface. I used to resent this place, she said without turning around. All the hours he spent out here instead of in the house with us. I thought he was escaping from family responsibilities. And now? I asked gently. Now I think maybe I was the one who didn't understand what family responsibility meant to him. She picked up one of his notebooks, flipping through pages of careful handwriting. I found these today while looking for the garage insurance policy. Sarah, your father kept detailed records of every person he helped, every favor he did, every time someone paid him with vegetables from their garden instead of cash. My heart stopped. What did you think about that? Mom closed the notebook, holding it against her chest. I thought about Mrs. Henderson, who always waved when I drove past her house. About the Ramirez family, whose landscaping made our property look beautiful every summer. About all the people in this town who spoke so highly of your father at the funeral. And how I never really understood why he inspired such loyalty. She turned to face me, tears in her eyes. I was so focused on protecting our financial security that I missed the fact that your father was building something bigger than security. He was building community, and that has value I never learned how to measure. This was the opening I'd been hoping for, the crack in Mom's defensive wall that might allow truth to enter without destroying everything. Mom, what if I told you that Dad's community work was actually financially successful? That his generosity didn't threaten our security because he'd found ways to make helping others sustainable? I'd ask you to show me the evidence, she said with the directness I'd inherited from her. So I did. I spread Dad's financial records across his workbench, explaining the foundation accounts, the business partnerships, the careful documentation that proved his community work had been not just sustainable, but profitable. I showed her bank statements that revealed assets we'd never known existed, investment accounts that had been growing steadily for 15 years, and the business plan that outlined his vision for expanding the work into an official nonprofit organization. Mom studied the documents with the same methodical attention she brought to her real estate contracts, asking sharp questions about cash flow, tax implications, and long-term sustainability. As a woman who'd built her own successful business, she recognized quality planning when she saw it. "Why didn't he tell me?" she asked finally, and the hurt in her voice was unmistakable. "Because he thought you'd worry about the risks," I said honestly. "He knew you'd want to protect the money for our family's future rather than using it to help others." He was probably right, she admitted. 15 years ago, I would have insisted he put every extra dollar into college funds and retirement accounts. I wouldn't have understood that helping others could be an investment in our community's future. And now? Mom looked around the garage with new eyes, seeing it not as Dad's escape from family responsibility, but as the headquarters of an operation that had strengthened dozens of families. "Now, I think your father was smarter about money than I ever gave him credit for. And I think I owe some people apologies for the assumptions I made about his business practices." The conversation continued past midnight, with Mom asking detailed questions about every family Dad had helped, every program he'd funded, every plan he'd developed for expanding the work. Her business instincts kicked in as she identified potential efficiencies, suggested improvements to the organizational structure, and began thinking strategically about how to maximize impact. "You realize this changes everything," she said as we finally prepared to head inside. "If we're going to continue your father's work properly, we can't do it secretly. The community needs to understand what's available to them, and we need transparency to build the kind of trust that sustains long-term charitable work." "Which means telling Michael and Jessica the truth about Dad," I said. Mom nodded grimly. "Which means admitting I was wrong about your father's priorities for 30 years. Tuesday morning brought the confrontation I'd been dreading. Michael had driven back from Columbus for what he thought was a routine meeting about estate logistics, while Jessica had delayed her flight to Portland to participate in family business discussions. They both sat at the kitchen table with expectant expressions, assuming I'd called them together to finalize arrangements for selling Dad's property and equipment. "Before we make any decisions about the garage," I began, "there are some things about Dad's business that you need to understand." Michael's phone was already buzzing with work calls, but he set it aside when he saw my serious expression. "What kind of things?" "Dad wasn't just running a small auto repair shop," I said. "He was operating a community foundation that's been helping local families for 15 years. Jessica laughed, not unkindly, but with genuine disbelief. "Dad? Running a foundation? Sarah?" He could barely balance his own checkbook. "Actually, he was excellent with money," Mom interjected quietly. "Better than any of us realized." That got Michael's attention. As a lawyer, he'd developed an instinct for recognizing when conversations were about to become legally significant. "What exactly are you saying?" I laid out the evidence systematically, the way I'd learned to present patient cases to skeptical doctors. Bank statements, investment records, documentation of ongoing commitments, and the scope of Dad's impact on families throughout Riverside. I watched their expressions shift from confusion to surprise, to something approaching awe as they realized the magnitude of what Dad had accomplished. $400,000, Michael repeated when I finished. Dad had $400,000 in foundation accounts, and none of us knew about it. "Why would he hide this from us?" Jessica asked. And unlike her earlier dismissiveness, this question carried genuine bewilderment. Mom answered before I could. "Because I taught him to hide it. Because every time he wanted to help someone, I complained about money being tight and other people's problems not being our responsibility. Because I made it clear that I saw his generosity as a threat to our family's security. The admission hung in the air like a confession, and I saw Michael and Jessica processing not just the revelation about Dad's secret life, but the implications for everything they thought they understood about our family dynamics. "So what happens now?" Michael asked, his lawyer instincts already working through the practical implications. "Do we continue the foundation work, or do we wind it down and distribute the assets?" "There are people depending on this support," I said. "Families who'll lose their homes if the housing assistance stops, kids who won't be able to attend college if the scholarship funds disappear. Dad built something that can't just be turned off without serious consequences." Jessica leaned forward, her artistic sensibilities engaging with the human drama of the situation. "How many people are we talking about? How many families would be affected?" I told them about Mary Patterson's family, about the scholarship recipients who were halfway through their education, about the elderly residents whose medication costs were subsidized through Dad's emergency fund. With each story, I watched their understanding deepen of the responsibility we'd inherited, along with Dad's assets. "This is incredible," Jessica said softly. "All those years, I thought Dad was just this sweet, simple guy who fixed cars and collected junk. But he was actually running a sophisticated operation that touched dozens of lives. The question is whether we're prepared to continue it," Michael said, ever practical. "This kind of work requires ongoing oversight, financial management, legal compliance. It's not something we can just dabble in part-time." I took a deep breath. I've already met with David Park about taking over the foundation management. And I have a meeting with the county commissioners on Friday to discuss expanding the program with government funding. Michael's eyebrows shot up. "You're serious about this?" "Dead serious. Dad spent 15 years building something remarkable, and I'm not going to let it die just because it's complicated." The discussion continued for hours, with Michael raising legal concerns, Jessica asking about the creative possibilities for community engagement, and Mom contributing business insights about sustainable growth and operational efficiency. By the end of the day, we'd developed a preliminary plan for transitioning the foundation from Dad's secret operation to a transparent family enterprise. It wouldn't be easy. There would be tax implications to navigate, legal structures to formalize, and community relationships to rebuild based on honesty rather than secrecy. But for the first time since Dad's death, I felt like we were moving towards something that honored both his legacy and our family's capacity for growth. Thursday evening, Tom joined us for dinner to discuss the operational details of continuing Dad's work. As he explained the mechanics of the automotive business that funded the foundation, I watched my family see him with new respect. This quiet man who'd seemed like a simple garage partner was actually the co-architect of an impressive social enterprise. Bob always said the most important thing was making sure the work continued even if something happened to him, Tom told us. He'd be amazed to see how quickly you've all embraced what he was trying to accomplish. "We should have embraced it 15 years ago, Mom said firmly. "Should have been part of building it instead of forcing him to hide it." Tom smiled gently. "Bob never saw it as hiding, Mrs. Mitchell. He saw it as protecting his family from worries they didn't need to carry while still doing work that needed to be done. He was proud of the balance he created." As we prepared for Friday's meeting with the county commissioners, I realized that Dad's death had done something unexpected. It had forced our family to see beyond our individual perspectives and recognize the larger possibilities that came from working together toward shared goals. His secret had become the foundation for a new kind of family collaboration, one built on truth instead of protective silence. The man who'd spent his life fixing broken things had managed, even in death, to repair the disconnections that had kept us from truly understanding each other. Tomorrow, I would present his vision to government officials who had the power to transform it into something even larger than he'd imagined. But tonight, surrounded by family members who finally understood what he'd been building, I felt his presence as clearly as if he were still here, guiding us toward possibilities he'd always believed we could achieve. Friday morning arrived with brilliant sunshine that felt like a good omen as I stood in front of my closet, choosing an outfit for the most important presentation of my life. I selected a navy blazer that had belonged to Dad, altered to fit me but still carrying the faint scent of his aftershave, paired with a crisp white shirt and my most professional shoes. In the mirror, I looked like someone who could command a boardroom, even though my hands were trembling with nerves. The Riverside County Administration Building loomed larger than I remembered from childhood trips to pay property taxes with Mom. Inside, the marble floors echoed with the footsteps of people conducting serious business, and I felt the weight of representing not just Dad's vision, but the needs of every family his foundation had touched. David Park met me in the lobby, carrying a briefcase full of documents and wearing the confident expression of someone who'd successfully navigated these waters many times before. "Remember," he said as we rode the elevator to the third floor, "Commissioner Williams is sympathetic to community programs, but she'll want detailed financial projections. Commissioner Rodriguez will ask about accountability measures and oversight procedures. Commissioner Chen focuses on long-term sustainability and integration with existing county services." The conference room was intimidating in its formality, with a large oval table surrounded by leather chairs and walls lined with portraits of past county officials. The three commissioners sat at one end, each with stacks of papers and expressions of polite skepticism. I recognized Commissioner Williams from her frequent appearances in the local newspaper, a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives. "Ms. Mitchell," she said as David and I took our seats, "please accept our condolences on your father's passing. Bob Mitchell was well regarded in this community, and we understand you're here to discuss continuing some aspect of his work." I placed Dad's proposal on the table, the document he'd spent months perfecting, and began the presentation he'd never had the chance to deliver. I explained the Foundation's current operations, the families being served, the automotive skills training program that could provide career pathways for young adults aging out of foster care. I presented financial data showing the program's sustainability and growth potential, partnership opportunities with existing county services, and measurable outcomes that demonstrated real impact on community welfare. Commissioner Rodriguez leaned forward during my explanation of the oversight procedures. "Ms. Mitchell, your father's informal approach may have worked for a small-scale operation, but government partnerships require extensive documentation, regular audits, and compliance with federal regulations. Are you prepared to transform a family charity into a professionally managed nonprofit organization?" The question went to the heart of my deepest fears. Was I qualified to step into Dad's shoes? Could I maintain the personal touch that had made his work so effective, while adding the institutional structure that government partnership would require? "Commissioner Rodriguez," I said, drawing on the confidence I'd developed during years of advocating for patients in complex medical situations, my nursing background has given me extensive experience with regulatory compliance, documentation requirements, and coordination between multiple agencies. I understand the difference between informal charity and professional nonprofit management, and I'm committed to meeting whatever standards are necessary to serve our community effectively. Commissioner Chen asked about integration with existing county programs, and I was ready with Dad's research on gaps in current services, particularly transportation barriers that prevented low-income residents from accessing employment opportunities, medical care, and educational resources. The automotive repair and training program could address these gaps while providing measurable economic benefits to the entire county. The beauty of Bob Mitchell's approach, I explained, was that he understood transportation as a foundational need that affects everything else. Families can't maintain employment without reliable vehicles. Students can't get to college classes. Elderly residents can't reach medical appointments. By providing affordable automotive services and training programs, we're not just fixing cars, we're removing barriers that keep people from achieving self-sufficiency. Commissioner Williams nodded thoughtfully. "You're describing a comprehensive approach to poverty reduction through transportation access. That's exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need to address persistent social challenges." The presentation continued for nearly 2 hours, with the commissioners asking detailed questions about budget projections, partnership agreements, staffing requirements, and performance metrics. I answered each question with information Dad had carefully researched and documented, feeling his presence in every statistic and strategy I presented. When the formal presentation ended, Commissioner Williams asked the other commissioners to step outside for a brief consultation. I sat in the conference room with David, my heart pounding as we waited for their decision. "You did exceptionally well," David whispered. "Your father would have been proud." The commissioners returned with expressions that gave nothing away. Commissioner Williams spoke for the group. "Ms. Mitchell, the county commissioners are prepared to approve a pilot partnership with the Mitchell Community Foundation. Contingent on your organization meeting specific regulatory requirements and establishing formal nonprofit status within 60 days. We're authorizing an initial contract worth $75,000 for the first year, with potential for expansion based on documented outcomes." The words hit me like a physical force. $75,000 in government funding would nearly double the foundation's capacity to help families. Dad's vision of transforming individual charity into sustainable community support was about to become reality. "There is one additional requirement," Commissioner Rodriguez added. "The county insists on public transparency for any organization receiving government funding. Your foundation's work will need to be documented and publicized as an example of effective community partnership." The requirement for public transparency meant the end of the secrecy that had protected Dad's work for 15 years. Our family's decision to embrace openness would now become a legal obligation, forcing us to stand behind our choice to honor Dad's legacy without hiding from potential criticism or family conflict. That afternoon, I drove straight to the elementary school to share the news with Mary Patterson. I found her in the cafeteria, preparing for the next day's lunch service, and when I explained about the county partnership and expanded funding, she started crying right there among the industrial-sized cans of tomato sauce. "This means Tommy can finish his automotive certification program," she said through her tears. "Means Maria can apply to schools we never thought we could afford. Means other families won't have to worry the way we did before your father stepped in." Her reaction crystallized something I'd been struggling to understand about Dad's work. This wasn't just about money, or even practical assistance. It was about dignity, about believing that everyone deserved the chance to build a better life, regardless of their starting circumstances. Dad had seen potential in people that others overlooked, had invested in possibilities that others considered too risky. That evening, our entire family gathered at the house to celebrate the county approval and plan the next steps for the foundation. Michael had taken the rest of the week off from his Columbus practice to help with the legal requirements for nonprofit status. Jessica had postponed her return to Portland indefinitely, excited about developing communication strategies that would help other communities learn from Dad's model. "I've been thinking about the name," Jessica said as we sat around the dining room table, surrounded by papers and laptops. "The Mitchell Community Foundation is fine for legal purposes, but we need something that captures what Dad was really doing. Something about fixing, about community, about bringing things back to life." Tom, who joined us for dinner and stayed for the planning session, smiled at her observation. "Bob always said he wasn't just fixing cars. He was fixing lives. Said every vehicle that left his garage carried someone toward a better future." "The rebuilding foundation," Mom suggested quietly, "because that's what he did. He rebuilt engines, rebuilt hope, rebuilt the connection between people who needed help and people who could provide it." The name felt perfect, capturing both the mechanical work that funded everything and the deeper mission of restoring possibilities that circumstances had damaged. We spent the next hour outlining transformation plans, discussing staffing needs, and dividing responsibilities among family members who'd never imagined working together on something this significant. Michael would handle legal compliance and financial management, bringing his professional expertise to ensure the foundation met all regulatory requirements. Jessica would develop outreach programs and communication strategies, using her artistic background to tell stories that helped donors and volunteers understand the foundation's impact. Mom would coordinate with local businesses and social service agencies, applying her real estate networking skills to build partnerships that amplified the foundation's effectiveness. I would serve as executive director, managing day-to-day operations and maintaining the personal relationships with families that had been central to Dad's approach. Tom would continue overseeing the automotive training programs while helping me learn the mechanical aspects of the work I'd never mastered. As the evening progressed, I realized we were experiencing something Dad had always hoped for but never expected to see. Our family united around a shared purpose that honored our individual strengths while serving something larger than ourselves. The secrecy that had protected his work had also prevented us from discovering how much we could accomplish together. The following weeks blurred together in a whirlwind of paperwork, meetings, and preparations for the Foundation's public launch. The local newspaper ran a front-page story about Dad's hidden philanthropy and our family's decision to continue his work transparently. The article generated responses that ranged from amazement to gratitude to occasional criticism from people who questioned whether private charity was more effective than government programs. One letter to the editor particularly stung, written by someone who suggested that Dad's secrecy proved he'd been ashamed of his charity work, that truly virtuous giving didn't require recognition or publicity. I struggled with the criticism until Tom reminded me that Dad hadn't been ashamed of his work, just protective of his family's peace and his recipients' dignity. The difference now, Tom explained, is that transparency serves the work instead of threatening it. People can't benefit from programs they don't know exist, and other communities can't learn from approaches they've never heard of. The official launch of the Rebuilding Foundation took place on a Saturday morning in October, exactly 2 months after Dad's death. We'd transformed the garage into a combination automotive training center and community meeting space, with displays explaining the Foundation's programs and opportunities for visitors to sign up as volunteers or service recipients. The turnout exceeded our wildest expectations. Mary Patterson brought her entire family, including Tommy, who'd completed his automotive certification and been hired as the Foundation's first paid apprentice instructor. Mrs. Henderson arrived with a casserole and stories about Dad's kindness that made several people cry. The Ramirez family came with their landscaping crew, offering to maintain the Foundation's grounds as their way of giving back. Commissioner Williams attended the launch, bringing local media attention that helped spread word about the Foundation throughout the county. During her remarks, she noted that the Rebuilding Foundation represented exactly the kind of innovative community partnership that government agencies needed to address complex social challenges effectively. That the moment that meant the most to me came when an elderly man I didn't recognize approached during the reception, introducing himself as Frank Morrison, a veteran who'd been struggling to maintain the modified vehicle he needed for his disability. "Your father fixed my truck 3 times over the past 5 years, he said quietly. Never charged me a dime, always said it was his honor to help someone who'd served the country." I thought that kind of generosity died with him, but seeing all this, he gestured around the bustling garage, I realize he built something that's going to outlast all of us. That night, as our family cleaned up after the launch event, I found myself alone in Dad's corner of the garage, surrounded by the tools and equipment that had enabled everything he'd accomplished. The familiar space felt different now, less like a shrine to his memory, and more like the foundation of something living and growing. I opened the leather journal he'd given me for graduation, turning to a fresh page to record the day's events and my thoughts about the journey we'd begun. As I wrote, I realized that Dad's greatest gift hadn't been the money he'd left or even the foundation he'd built. It had been his example of what became possible when someone chose to see potential instead of problems, to invest in solutions instead of complaining about circumstances. The girl who discovered her father's secrets in a safety deposit box 6 weeks earlier was gone, replaced by a woman who understood that some inheritances require not just accepting what's been left behind, but transforming it into something even greater than the original vision. Dad had given us the foundation, but building the future was our responsibility. 1 year later, I stood in the same conference room where I'd first presented Dad's vision to the county commissioners, but this time the meeting felt like a celebration rather than a terrifying leap into the unknown. The Rebuilding Foundation's annual report lay open on the table, documenting 12 months of growth that had exceeded every projection we'd dared to make. Commissioner Williams smiled as she reviewed the statistics. 63 families receiving ongoing support, 18 young adults completing automotive certification programs, and a 92% success rate for job placement after training completion. These numbers are remarkable, Ms. Mitchell. The remarkable part, I replied, is how much the community has embraced the transparency. We've had volunteers step forward who never knew Dad's work existed, donors who want to expand the programs, and other counties asking how they can replicate our model. The foundation had indeed become something larger than Dad's original vision. Jessica's communication strategies had attracted national attention from nonprofit organizations studying innovative approaches to poverty reduction. Michael's legal framework had been adopted by 3 other communities starting similar programs. Mom's business partnerships had created a network of local employers who prioritized hiring our training program graduates. But the transformation I was most proud of was personal. The woman sitting in this boardroom, confidently discussing budget allocations and program expansion, bore little resemblance to the grieving daughter who'd once felt invisible in her own family. Dad's legacy hadn't just survived his death, it had flourished because his belief in hidden potential had proven true for his own daughter. After the meeting, I drove to Pine Street to check on Mary Patterson, whose family had become a symbol of the foundation's success. Tommy now managed our youth training program while completing his business degree part-time. Maria had started her sophomore year at Ohio State on a full scholarship, majoring in social work with plans to return to Riverside after graduation. Their mother had been promoted to head of food services at the school district, her confidence boosted by years of knowing she had reliable support. "Sarah," Mary called from her front porch. "Perfect timing. I just finished baking cookies for tonight's volunteer appreciation dinner." The monthly dinners had become one of my favorite foundation traditions, bringing together everyone involved in the work. Families receiving support, community volunteers, business partners, and our staff. Tonight's gathering would be special because we were announcing the newest expansion of Dad's original vision. At the community center that evening, I looked around tables filled with faces that had become family over the past year. Mrs. Henderson sat with Frank Morrison, the veteran whose truck Dad had repaired, now volunteering as a mentor for young adults entering our program. The Ramirez family had brought their entire extended clan, including cousins who'd started small businesses with foundation microloans. Tom Bradley stood to address the crowd, his quiet demeanor unchanged, despite his new role as our head of operations. Bob Mitchell always said the best repairs were the ones nobody noticed, the ones that just made things work better without calling attention to themselves. Looking around this room tonight, I think he'd be amazed to see how visible his invisible work has become. I rose to make the evening's major announcement. 1 year ago, our family discovered that Dad had been secretly supporting this community for 15 years. Tonight, I'm excited to share that the county commissioners have approved funding for the Rebuilding Foundation to open a second location in neighboring Franklin County, where we'll be partnering with local organizations to serve rural communities that lack access to reliable, automotive services. The applause was enthusiastic, but what moved me most was seeing Mom's expression of quiet pride. She'd spent the past year rebuilding her own understanding of what security meant, discovering that investing in community strength created more lasting stability than hoarding resources for individual protection. Later that night, after the last volunteer had left and the community center was cleaned and locked, our family gathered at the house for our own private reflection. It had become our tradition, these post-event conversations where we processed the day's successes and planned for future challenges. "I've been thinking about Dad's letters," I said as we sat in the living room, the same space where we'd first learned about his hidden life. Especially the one where he wrote about being proud of my choice to become a nurse, about seeing the same desire to help people that drove his work. Jessica looked up from her laptop, where she'd been editing photos from the evening's event. "What about it?" I used to think he was just being encouraging, trying to make me feel better about choosing a practical career instead of something more ambitious. But now I understand he was recognizing something in me that I didn't see in myself. Michael nodded thoughtfully. He saw potential that circumstances hadn't yet revealed, the same way he looked at families in crisis and saw possibilities for recovery instead of permanent problems. Mom set down her coffee cup, her expression reflective. "Your father had a gift for seeing people's hidden strengths. I spent 30 years thinking he was naive about human nature, but actually he understood it better than any of us. He knew that most people want to contribute something meaningful if they're given the opportunity and support to do so." The conversation continued past midnight, weaving together memories of Dad with plans for the foundation's future. We talked about the ripple effects we'd observed, how families who'd received help were now volunteering to help others, how our training program graduates were starting their own small businesses, how the model was inspiring similar initiatives across the state. As I prepared for bed, I stopped in Dad's old garage, now the Foundation's headquarters but still containing the corner where he'd spent countless evenings planning and dreaming. His tools remained exactly where he'd left them, but they were no longer museum pieces preserving his memory. They were working instruments used daily by the young adults learning trades that would support their families for decades to come. I opened the leather journal he'd given me, now filled with a year's worth of entries documenting the Foundation's growth and my own evolution. On the final page, I wrote about the unexpected gift his death had become. The discovery that losing someone you love doesn't have to mean losing their influence on the world. Dad's secret life had revealed itself not as deception, but as preparation. Every family he'd helped, every system he'd built, every relationship he'd cultivated, had been laying groundwork for something that could survive his absence and grow beyond his individual capacity to nurture it. The brass key that had unlocked his safety deposit box still sat on my nightstand, but its significance had transformed. It no longer represented the discovery of hidden secrets, but rather the opening of possibilities that continued expanding with each life we touched, each barrier we removed, each young person we equipped with skills and confidence. Standing in the quiet garage, surrounded by evidence of work that had outlasted its creator, I finally understood what Dad had been trying to teach me through years of patient example. The most important things we build aren't the ones that bear our names or bring us recognition. They're the ones that create foundations for others to build upon, that solve problems quietly and sustainably, that transform individual suffering into community strength. His legacy lived not in the money he'd saved or the buildings that bore his name, but in the countless small moments when someone's car started reliably, when a family stayed housed, when a young person discovered capabilities they'd never known they possessed. These invisible repairs to the fabric of community life would continue long after anyone remembered the man who'd made them possible. As I turned off the garage lights and headed toward the house, I carried with me the peaceful certainty that comes from discovering your purpose. Dad's greatest gift hadn't been the foundation he'd built in secret, but the example he'd provided of what became possible when someone chose to see potential instead of problems, to invest quietly in solutions instead of waiting for someone else to take action. The girl who'd once felt invisible in her own family had become a woman whose work touched hundreds of lives, whose voice carried weight in community decisions, whose vision was shaping policy in multiple counties. But more importantly, I'd become someone who understood that the most meaningful inheritance isn't what we receive, but what we choose to do with what we've been given. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new families needing support, new opportunities to expand the work Dad had started in his corner of a garage behind our house. But tonight, surrounded by evidence of transformation and possibility, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from honoring someone's memory by surpassing their original dreams. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.